Hello, everyone, and welcome to Empire State Weekly. I'm Tim Lake in Albany. For the first time now since his State of the State address, Governor Cuomo is unveiling more details on his plan to amend New York State's tax code. Now, the proposal would create a voluntary payroll tax to replace the current state income tax. The plan, the governor says, would shield New Yorkers from federal tax changes that reduce deductions we can now take for paying our state and local taxes.
We built our tax codes around the foundational premise that state and local taxes would be deductible. It took 100 years when we created the federal personal income tax system. So the point here is not changing it all immediately. We're providing for these changes to incrementally go into place.
Now, if this plan passes, it would happen very fast, beginning in January of 2019. But for many, it's still unclear exactly what is a payroll tax. I'm joined now by Bob Rock, a business lawyer and managing partner with Tully, Rinckey, and also our weekly contributor, Diane Donato from WGY News Radio here in the Capital Region. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It's very
Bob,
pleased
you're
to be
already
here.
involved in the nitty-gritty of this, and this is a difficult thing for a lot of us to get our minds wrapped around. I want to ask you, how viable do you think these two main aspects of the proposal are? There's the idea of changing whether or not it's a payroll tax or the individual tax, and then the charitable deduction. With the payroll tax, how viable is that?
Well, I think the payroll tax question is probably more viable than the charitable deduction, just because of some implications of whether the Internal Revenue will allow those charitable deductions and the uncertainty that it could provide, particularly for funding in school districts. With regard to the payroll tax, this is, we're breaking new ground here. So essentially what we're doing is looking at shifting a tax from the individual employees over to the employer, and it's kind of a whack-a-mole kind of game. So you push down the tax liability on one side, you push it up on the other. It does have viability. I think there are some emotional things, psychological hurdles that are going to have to be overcome. So with the payroll tax proposal, one of the key elements of that is going to be a reduction in salary. Now, that's not going to mean that the person would actually have less take-home pay. The net at the end of the day should be the same, but nobody likes to take a pay cut.
How would a reduction in salary impact me, even if it's on paper?
Well, chances are it won't, okay, because what you're really looking at is the net take-home pay. What is your disposable income? What do you have to pay the bills, to go on vacation, and the things that we all like to do? So the concept with payroll tax is reduce the salary, thereby reducing the income tax that has to be paid to fit within the new federal guidelines that are coming at us, and therefore net out to the same amount. Okay, so if you're paying less over in tax, even though you're making less, at the end of the day, it should be the same to you.
Now, the other thing that Diane and I have been reporting on here in New York is it's voluntary versus mandatory. How would this work if some people could opt in and others wouldn't opt in?
That's the great question, and that's the question that I'm really struggling with in dealing with business clients, trying to identify. There is a perception, and I think justifiably so, that the new federal tax act gives some advantages to businesses, perhaps at the expense of taking away some deductions in states like New York, New Jersey, California. So the concept is to have this voluntary payroll tax that the employer would then administer. I don't know how many businesses are going to sign on to that. No one likes something new. Businesses know how to deal with the tax code in New York as it's set up now. There are many uncertainties in this new proposal. One is it's voluntary. Will people sign on to it? I just don't know.
Bob, I've been watching, as I'm sure you have, the reaction of the Business Council and various other business groups, and they have been lukewarm, I think, at least publicly on this, and they're skeptical. They're even a little mistrusting. I've sensed some concern that this is going to open the door. They're worried that this will open the door to other taxes then also being shifted over to the businesses in New York State. What are you hearing?
Well, I'm hearing the same things, and let's face it, there has been quite a vocal element in the business community for many years that New York is a very heavily regulated state as regards business. It's very heavily taxed. And I'm hearing that if the concept behind the payroll tax is to keep businesses and high income people in the state, don't add another layer on us, don't give us more responsibilities, especially when we don't know and nobody really knows the details of this just yet. So there is, I think, considerable apprehension, and justifiably so, in the business community right now.
There's apparently a disparity in the number of people this would greatly affect, whether they're downstate or upstate. What are you seeing as far as the income differences between the two regions and how this would affect people?
Yeah, it's really hard, Tim, to try and reconcile all the numbers. I mean, we can talk about the new federal cap on the so-called SALT deductions, that's state and local taxes, at $10,000 when the average is said to be $22,000. So immediately it's, oh, if you itemize, you're going to lose $12,000 under the new federal proposal. But that depends on how much you're paying in property taxes and how much you're paying in local taxes. So it is going to have a disparity. I think that the impact of the federal changes are going to be felt more downstate than they are upstate, just because of the disparity in income, the disparity in property values, and therefore the tax levels.
Bob, I'm sure many of the businesses you work with have business here in New York State and other states as well. As all these changes happen, as we have this reputation as being high tax and high regulation for business, and now there's this new set of things that may come to pass, are people talking to you about, hey, I'm thinking about moving more of my business out of New York State?
Oh, good question.
It's a great question. It's one that certainly concerns us because we don't want to lose any businesses. No, I have not heard that question directly in connection with this proposal. Remember, the proposal is very new. We start out with a 37-page outline that has a whole set of different possibilities, from a straight payroll tax to some kind of a hybrid, keeping the old system in place. But the key thing, and what I talk to businesses about when the question is raised, how is this going to impact me, say, remember, it's voluntary. Okay, it's voluntary, so you don't have to at this point in time. There is a concern that at some point in time, if it comes in, you know, mission creep, they'd call it, I think, in the military, so that if it comes in on a voluntary basis, a year, 2, 5 down the line, does it suddenly become mandatory and permanent? So,
Bob, we have about a minute left here. You advise business clients on tax issues. So our natural question here for the end would be, if I'm a small business in one of the major cities in upstate New York, or a personal taxpayer here in upstate New York, what should I be doing at this point to get ready for this if it's passed?
Well, I think the first thing you should be doing is consulting with your tax advisor and see how it's going to impact you. I think the great majority of the individuals, the citizens, taxpayers, are not going to be impacted by this. When it gets to the business side of things, then you have to determine, you know, what impact is this going to have on your employee retention. Again, coming back to nobody wants to take a pay cut.
Right.
And is it truly voluntary? What are the advantages to me as a business owner, which means what are the advantages to my employees in signing on for this?
Right. Well, even after all of that, we're still confused. I think taxpayers
I think we may
are
be
as
for a
well.
while.
Coming up, recognition for some New York correctional facilities, but it's not for the right reasons. We'll tell you which 4 jails and prisons are identified as the worst of the worst, and also what's being done to try to make them better. Plus, a push to put fewer people behind bars. We'll tell you what lawmakers are doing to keep some people from being sent to jail in the first place. Welcome back to Empire State Weekly. I'm Tim Lake in Albany. The state is planning to make quick changes to 4 jails now, following a report by a watchdog agency identifying them as the worst in New York State. Now, the Commission of Correction listed the worst offenders as the Greene County Jail, that's in Catskill, the Buffalo area's Erie County Holding Center and Correctional Facility, the Dutchess County Jail in Poughkeepsie, and the Syracuse area's Onondaga County Justice Center and Penitentiary. And that's on top of the decision just last week to close the infamous Rikers Island Jail, which is in New York City. Now, Senate Democrats and Governor Cuomo are pushing a plan to end the cash bail requirement for nonviolent offenders in New York State. They say that thousands of New Yorkers are just sitting in jail waiting for their trials simply because they don't have the money to post bail.
The poor person is sitting at Rikers waiting months, sometimes years. The person of wealth is home waiting for his day in trial and is free.
Our criminal justice system is broken, and we have to fix it.
All right, there are the Senate Democrats. Now, there are certainly horror stories about Rikers Island, but it is a problem in some upstate jails as well. So without cash bail, would suspects report to court when they are supposed to? Joining us here now on Empire State Weekly is the Saratoga County Sheriff, Michael Zurlo, along with Diane Donato from WGY Radio here in the Capital Region. Sheriff, thank you so much for joining us here today on Empire State Weekly.
You're welcome. Thanks for
All right,
having
let's start with the situation in your jail in Saratoga County. Is it an issue where you, in some cases, have far too many inmates in the jail simply because they can't afford cash bail?
It is not in my county. As of this morning, I have 193 inmates in my facility. 14 of those are in there on cash bail. So we monitor that along with the district attorney's office. So at this point, it's not a problem in my county.
So this is obviously a very human issue, and these are people who, we should note, have not been convicted yet if they're awaiting trial. Let's, though, talk about some of the costs, because we as taxpayers are all paying it. Let's talk about the cost of having them sit in jail awaiting trial versus the cost of maybe having to get somebody back who's been released on bail and hasn't come back for their trial.
Typically, an average inmate will cost me about $120 a day. So with the $14 or 14 inmates, you can do the math. I think for the most part, the inmates that are in my facility now, the bail is less than $1,000. Where family has been contacted to see if they could come in and bail them out. So that number will go down, and they're not in there for any length of time. Typically, family members or relatives will come and bail them out.
What if you had to go get them, though, afterwards? Then what kind of cost would we look at?
I have 500 outstanding warrants now in my county. This proposal will probably triple the amount of warrants that we have. People don't want to get arrested in general. To go back and have to arrest them the second time I think poses a danger for law enforcement and the public. So it adds more resources for my department where we're a busy county. So do I have to hire or redirect deputies just to try to get that backlog of warrants down? So I think typically the judges do a great job now in weeding out who comes to jail and who doesn't come to jail.
On the other hand, this issue has come up mostly because of the issues in New York City and in Rikers Island. The Senate Democrats are from Queens who are bringing this up. The governor, with his connections to downstate, is bringing this up as well. The problems there are very, very real, and they're trying to alleviate them. Mm-hmm. So what should we do here upstate when they have the problems downstate?
I think they should address their problems downstate. I think the process is working good upstate, especially in my county. If they had these issues down there for these years, maybe something should have been addressed. I don't want to get into a battle upstate, downstate, but I just feel that this bail proposal will affect us. Upstate, what resources in my department trying to have to go back out and rearrest the person for a second time.
What kind of people are we talking about? What kind of suspects are we talking about?
We're talking about misdemeanors, petty larceny, grand larceny, people involved in domestic issues, which could pose a problem where a judge will release somebody if this proposal goes through involving a domestic. That person's now has the opportunity to go back and do something, to that family member again. So, again, I think our judges look at when a defendant comes to see if bail is necessary, and I think they do a good job at it. Maybe they ought to look at the Office of Court Administration, doing additional training for judges, and in regards to how bail should be applied.
Sheriff, you've mentioned a couple of times now about thinking that the judges do a good job. In some states and in Washington, D.C., they're employing different algorithms and some different programs, the Arnold Foundation Public Safety Assessment, where they go through a number of questions to help determine whether or not somebody should be eligible for jail. We don't really have that in New York State right now, do we?
Well, most of the judges do go through that when a defendant is brought before them. They'll ask where they live, what's their income, et cetera. So in a lot of law enforcement, when they bring a defendant in front of the judge, will have some of those answers for the judge ahead of time. So I think that is happening here.
One of the options in this is that people would be on the honor system, essentially. You talk to sheriffs around the state. What do you think would happen, and how do you think sheriffs react to this, that people are told, well, you promised to come back to court to face your charges?
Well, a lot of times the promise doesn't work, and we'll reap the problems with that. And like I said earlier, eventually, if the person says he's going to come back, people don't want to have to deal with the issues that they were initially dealt with. So the judge will have to issue a warrant, and we'll have to deal with the problem again for a second time.
Of course, some of the stories we've seen have been heartbreaking about people languishing in jails, waiting for their trial. And so many people have a sense that justice is not immune to the powers of the pocketbook, and that the poor are disproportionately affected, and even the middle class. I think many people in the middle class will say they believe that if you're rich, you're going to have a different experience working through the wheels of justice. So we can't necessarily say that there's nothing to be concerned about here, can we?
And I can speak for my county. For the defendants that are in the facility, I know our district attorney's office and our public defender's office look at these cases, and if they don't drag on in the system. So they're moved up. Typically, a defendant that's in there will go back the following week back to court for his next court appearance, and if the judge feels at that point that the defendant can be released, he will be released.
One more issue here. I understand there's a difference between the sheriffs in the upstate and law enforcement downstate. But what is the Sheriff's Association doing in upstate New York to try to deal with this?
This has been discussed at our meetings. They're working with legislators at the Capitol to try to address this and see, there's certain areas of this whole bail proposal, see if some of the areas can be worked out.
Well, listen, Sheriff Zurlo from Saratoga County, thank you very much for joining us here on Empire State Weekly. Well, that brings us to this week's political poll. Do you think New York should eliminate the long-standing practice of requiring defendants to post cash bail? We'll have your answers coming up just a little bit later in the program. Also coming up, the race to become New York's next governor is really heating up now. We'll tell you who one powerful Republican lawmaker is throwing his support behind.
I understand the frustration of the American people. It's over and over and over again, and it's madness. And there's a bustle of activity in the aftermath, and then it goes away. We actually did something in the state of New York. We had the Sandy Hook massacre 5 years ago, Sandy Hook in Connecticut, but it's right on the New York border. And people were outraged, 28 school children. It was horrific. And we actually did something about it. And we passed something called the SAFE Act, which is basically common sense gun control. Why have AR-15s, right? You don't hunt with it. You don't shoot birds with it. That's what our law did in New York.
Now, that is Governor Cuomo, of course, speaking to CNN's Jim Sciutto in the wake of the high school massacre in Florida. Gun control, of course, now in the national spotlight after those 17 people were killed by a gunman there in Florida. Governor Cuomo was referring to New York's SAFE Act, which was enacted in 2012 after the Newtown shooting, the Sandy Hook school. There is additional legislation now in the works here in New York State to ban those bump stops and to keep weapons away from domestic violence offenders. The gun issue also expected to be a hot topic for this election year here in New York, and early signs are suggesting it will not be a cakewalk for New York's leading Democrats as they are seeking re-election this year. Now, Governor Cuomo has a 47% approval rating in a new Quinnipiac University poll. Also, Senator Kirsten Gillibrand just barely breaking the 50% mark. Attorney General Eric Schneiderman also has a 52% approval rating in New York State. Now, on the Republican side of the election, Senate Majority Leader John Flanagan throwing his support behind Syracuse Senator John DeFrancisco and his bid to become governor. Former Erie County Executive Joel Giambra also in the running. Republicans' party, though, has said they they are looking for one candidate to take on Governor Cuomo. Now, the Republicans meeting, they are looking to become unified on primary day in New York, but that date could actually change. Right now, the primary election is scheduled for September 11th, but a proposal on the governor's desk now would move it to September 13th. Both chambers say the move is out of respect, of course, for the victims of 9/11 and for Jewish New Yorkers who will be observing Rosh Hashanah. Now, earlier on Empire State Weekly, we discussed the pros and the cons of making defendants of minor crimes post cash bail. Do you agree with the governor and Senate Democrats on removing cash bail in New York State, or with the sheriff who has to enforce the laws of the state? We have your answer coming up in a few minutes. Here on Empire State Weekly, we asked you if you think that New York should eliminate the long-standing practice of requiring defendants in minor cases to post cash bail. So here now is a look at the tally. Nearly 2-to-1 in favor of ditching the cash bail requirements. And of course, we'll be interested to see how that legislation takes shape this year here in the state legislature in Albany. For now, though, for all of us here on Empire State Weekly, I'm Tim Lake in Albany, and we'll see you right back here next week. And don't forget, you can watch Empire State Weekly all over New York State. Here is the full schedule of Empire State Weekly in 9 New York regions.